Well, good afternoon. I'm Jim Sievers, the Interim Director of the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy and the School of Foreign Service, and it's a pleasure to welcome you this afternoon to our talk on big data, global diplomacy, and our global heartbeat. Today's speaker, Kalev Litaru, is spending this academic year at Georgetown with the support of the Yahoo Fund on International Values, Communication Technologies, and the Global Internet. Kalev comes to us from the University of Illinois, where he held numerous fellowships and served as the senior research scientist for content analysis. Kalev, he's been here for a couple of months now, and he is a scholar, thinker, doer on the cutting edge of really devising ways to use technology, data to understand and I think change the world. One of his most interesting recent projects is the creation of the global database on events, language, and tone, the GDELT. This has got 250 million global events from 1979 to the present in this database. For graduate students in the room, Kalev will be teaching a course at MSFS in the spring of this year, which we're looking forward to. And before we get started, just one thing I want to say. Kalev thinks very fast. And my experience is that all that he has to say is really worth listening to. And please join me in welcoming Kalev Litaru.
Wow, thanks for such a rousing introduction. Now I actually have to live up to the introduction. Perfect. So, I want to start off by telling you a story. A story that begins 4.5 billion years ago with the creation of this planet called Earth. About 1 billion years go by till the first life starts swimming around those primordial oceans. A few more billion years go by to about 50,000 years ago. The first modern humans take those first steps. Something really extraordinary happens about 38,000 years ago. The first surviving evidence of cave paintings shows up. About 8,000 years ago, the first surviving evidence of writing begins appearing. These early humans, almost from the dawn of time, are trying to leave a permanent record of what's happening, of their innermost dreams and fears. 500 years ago, the printing press occurs. 20 years ago, the first graphical web browser shows up on the scene. 10 years ago, arguably, social media begins. So you see this curve, almost from the dawn of modern humans. As technologies continue to evolve, we've attempted to leave more and more information at more and more rapid pace. Humans are trying to document themselves. Now, of course, fast forward to today, we've reached an incredible point in human history. Electricity has reached almost every corner of the planet today. And with the march of electricity comes the march of media. It's a little bit hard to see here, but every red dot on this screen is a location where one or more tweets have been sent over a 1 month period last year. Blue are areas where there's still a little bit more power than Twitter. What's really remarkable about this is pretty much around the world, where there's power, there's Twitter. And it turns out, actually, they're incredibly, incredibly highly correlated. The most remote little pocket of power out in a rural Africa brings with it connections to the global network. And this is really exciting because the moment we have that connection, we can start hearing from those people. We can start seeing, listening to them. Facebook alone claims over 1 billion members. Now, obviously, those billion members are people's cats, the Statue of Liberty, a lot of other things there. But still, you think about that potentially upwards of 1/7 of the global population may be represented by Facebook. They claim over 1 trillion connections among them. And this is something they did. They did this back in December of 2010. So this is already, 2-3 years old now. And it's really amazing. What amazes me about this is they basically took their big network of who's a friend with whom and just made a picture of it. And that amazes me that today we've reached a point where you have this much data where you could just make a picture of how we're connected as a human society. To put everything in perspective, potentially upwards of 1/3 of the global population is online. There are as many cell phones as people on Earth. I love that one. I mean, there are as many cell phones as there are humans on this planet. Facebook alone has over 240 billion photographs. You think about what that means. You think about what we know 2,000 years ago of major world leaders. We have just a tiniest fraction of them. The average college kid today, I'm sure this doesn't apply to any of our Georgetown students here, but the average college kid goes out, and they take, every night they're taking, just documenting everything that they do. The evening at the bar now is shared with the entire world and documented forever. So you think about the photographic, evidence that we have of our daily lives, which I think will be very fascinating, in a presidential election, 20, 30 years from now, when people's, barroom antics from freshman year of college are entered as part of, the campaigning process. It should be it's a very interesting world we live in today. Every year, my favorite number down here is 1.6 million days worth of video are uploaded to YouTube every single year. You think about what this means in terms of that ever-growing live documentary of human society. Every day, 2.5 billion new items are added to Facebook, 300 million photographs, half a petabyte of data is posted to Facebook every single day. As many words are posted to Twitter every single day as in the entire New York Times over the last half century. You think about that incredible volume. Now again, a lot of Twitter, of course, are automated robots and advertising and such, but still, you think about the volume of material that we have today. Every minute, potentially 600 new websites are created. 250,000 images are posted to Facebook or tweets sent. Again, just a massive volume. What's exciting to me about this is the fact that with this data deluge that's arriving today, is computing is finally sort of catching up with allowing us to process this. You think about, for the dawn, we often talk about, we have too much data. We can't do, we have too much data to process. But you think about, we've always had too much data. In fact, many of our brain structures were evolved for early humans that had to separate out of all the things going on. What's a potential threat? That large animal staring at me with its teeth bared over there in the corner, that might be a threat. This pocket of fruit as I walk by on the ground, that might be something I can eat. And so a lot of our early brain structures evolved to help us synthesize all this deluge of information and filter very rapidly what do we need to understand. The beautiful part today is that machines are allowing us increasingly to do that. As people, you look at all those numbers I just flashed by on the screen, increasingly, more and more of our communication, like Twitter, is occurring entirely through the digital world. The physical world, we're live digitizing it, we're photographing that, we're blogging about it. All this information is entering that digital world. It's passing over a global network of machines that can process that. So increasingly, our physical and our virtual heartbeats are beating as one. And this means that we can use machines. We can leverage these large machines now that are storing all this data to be able to sift out for the first time new and interesting pieces of information on human society. If ever we are at a point where we can start measuring that global heartbeat, we're fast approaching that. Today, people from Bangladesh to Buenos Aires busily tell one another and their neighbors what they see, what they think, what's important to them. You think about, for example, the first confirmation of Osama bin Laden's death. That was actually the Osama bin Laden, the raid on him. That was actually live tweeted by a Pakistani journalist. Saying there are strange helicopters flying overhead. It was confirmed back here in the U.S., not by an official, nice conference in the Rose Garden, but by a tweet from a foreign administration official saying, "I just heard from my buddy in the White House. We got him." The first confirmation of Gaddafi's capture was a live cell phone video shot by a participant on the scene and uploaded to YouTube rapidly. You think about what this means for our changing world of information. In particular, citizens are becoming a vast ground-based social sensor network, telling us what's happening from around the world. This is one of my favorite images. This is the election of the new Pope, 2005 and 2013. I love in the 2005 image, this one lovely little camera phone right here. And you think about it, 2005, our understanding of that, really comes from what the major television networks were set up in the back capturing. Down here in 2013, I love this iPad here. It always amuses me to see people, traveling, and they're holding up this huge iPad trying to get a picture. But you look at every one of those little images right there, just how much the world is changing in terms of, I'm sure every one of these people was posting to Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and so on, and all of those different perspectives, both, what they were capturing, so different angles, but also I'm sure every one of these people posted it and said something about it, said what they were feeling in that instant. From as long as we've had media has always shifted. Media has always closely tracked population. So it's always moved both to inform and inform upon global society. So what we have here, this is actually the progression of American newspapers from the 1750s to present. So you can see the westward expansion, and as population moves ever westward, the news media is following that. The news media is tracking that, which means that we always have media somewhere to give us perspectives on things. What really excites me, though, is this graph. This is the percentage of the world's news media that's available through the web. And you can see it very closely tracks the rise of the web. As of 2010, nearly half of all media, whether that's broadcast, print, radio, television, all languages, was available through electronic means. And this is very exciting because when you're talking about a low 2-watt broadcaster in southern Zimbabwe, you can't scoop that up from a satellite. You can't get that from the embassy. You have to expend a lot of resources to try and monitor the world's news media. When it's available electronically, when it's on the web, machines can process this. They can scrape. When this is available through Google News, you can instantly access it, but machines can process that. They can catalog what's occurring across the world. At the same time, we have this, obviously this amazing ecosystem now of social media. Almost every point of our lives now are represented, in some form, whether that's mainstream or social channels. Now you might say, well, okay, wow, we live in a wonderful big data world. There's so much data out there. What can we possibly do with all this that's interesting? So this is a project we did early last year to say, what does Wikipedia tell us about global society? What can we learn? What would happen if we took Wikipedia and treated it not as just a big pile of text, but tried to do something interesting with it? So the idea there was to basically ask us, what does it tell us of world history? So we use what's called full text geocoding. Basically, when you type something to Google Maps, Google knows whatever you typed in there is a location. It just has to find where that is on a map. Full text geocoding, you hand it a big pile of text, and you say, find me if there's any locations in here. So reference to Cairo. Well, all of a sudden now it has to decide, is this Cairo, Egypt, or Cairo, Illinois? If it says Georgian authorities arrested 20, was that the US state, or is that the country in Europe? Paris Hilton versus the Hilton in Paris. So it's a big, complex process. We're basically looking at all the context around it to try and understand it. And then similarly extracting out every date. And ultimately, we looked just at the English language version, which is about 4 million articles. And there were over 80 million locations mentioned across the text of those, and over 42 million dates in the last 1,000 years across that. Something I want to mention that's kind of interesting about this is that Wikipedia, you can actually, believe it or not, you can actually go into a Wikipedia page if you know what you're doing and hand tag something and say, this refers to a particular geographic coordinate. And so most people that have said, well, Wikipedia, it only focuses on the US and part of Europe, they've largely been using these hand tag codes. But the thing is that, probably, if anyone in this room has edited Wikipedia a lot, I'm sure you probably haven't done, even if you've ever contributed to a Wikipedia page, you probably didn't go through and hand tag geographic coordinates there. And so it turns out that the map up here, long story short, the map in the upper left are basically, it's a heat map showing you where people have hand tagged stuff. And red means that there's a massive overdensity of points. You can see that pretty much, a lot of places where people have gone in and hand tagged the coordinate in Wikipedia, again, is the eastern seaboard of the US and Europe. Down here, this is through automated geocoding. And it turns out this is a much more even, so you see less dots, which is good because that means that it's much more even with population. Essentially, what this is telling us is that, we're fast, historically, like libraries, for example, you had every new book that arrived on library, someone sat down, they kind of skimmed it, and they came up with the subject tags for it. That's how we indexed information. Because, you couldn't dream, think of 100 years ago, you need those subject tags to be able to make sense of what you had in the library. What we're finding is that the human applied tags just aren't that good. Machines, because machines can read through the entirety of the text. They can spot that buried little reference somewhere that can be tremendously valuable. What's even more exciting, though, is this graph here. This is the total number of mentions of each year over the last 1,000 years. And obviously, you can see about 1800 really starts rising. And obviously, as we hit the web era, the number of mentions skyrocket. What's interesting is this graph down here. This is a zoom in, 1950 to present. And you can see it skyrockets up, but then it levels off. And it turns out, over the last, I think, 4 years now, since there's an extra dot here, each year, by the end of the next year, about 1.8 million references were added about the previous year to Wikipedia. Now this is very interesting because 2011 is here and we didn't see, you think, wow, there should be a surge of references. No, 1.8 million added additions to Wikipedia. And so this is very interesting because this seems to be a magic number. There are 1.8 million important things that are worthy of Wikipedia that occur in the world each year. Now, whether this reflects some amazing new, and I should add, Wikipedia continues to grow. So it's not that Wikipedia is leveling off, but most of that growth is people going back and adding stuff to the past. So what this is telling us is that there's either something magical about human society, or more likely something about the type of people that edit Wikipedia and what is sort of worthy of inclusion in Wikipedia. Now, again, as they say, deserves further exploration. As you always add at the end of a paper. But it's very interesting. For the first time, we can peer inside of data at this scale and actually ask questions like this. This graph at the bottom, this is the overall tone. So higher numbers are more positive, lower numbers are more negative of all mentions of each year. You notice that big gap, about 1500, the world becomes massively more negative according to Wikipedia. And you say, how could that possibly be? I mean, you got the Renaissance here, you have a lot of things here. It turns out there's a fundamentally different set of authors that edit discussion of the pre-1500 and post-1500. Seems about 1500 is like this magic number where there's fundamentally different people and they use very different language. Now, likely that's because people talking about certain areas are probably more real historians. Actually, you'll notice the American Civil War, according to Wikipedia, is the most negative event that's occurred worldwide in the last 1,000 years. In fact, way more negative than World War I or II. Again, and this, of course, reflects that there's a lot of Civil War buffs that edit Wikipedia. So this allows us, you imagine, to start off with just this big pile of text, Wikipedia, and be able to plow it through this and be able to visualize and understand it and pick out very interesting trends like this that can tell us very interesting things. But of course, what we want to do is do something really cool, like put it in a map. So this is an animation of world history according to Wikipedia. Basically, for each year as it goes by, any mention in Wikipedia of a location with respect to that year, a dot is put in the map. So if it says in London, and we'll see World War II come up a little bit. If it says in London in 1872, we'll put a dot there. If it says 2 months later, we'll put a dot there. If it says a year later, then we'll put a dot with the following year. And then any set of locations that are mentioned with respect to the same year in the same article, we draw connections between them. And the coloring, bright green is very positive, bright red is very negative. And I'll show this to you again. And so you can imagine, essentially what we're doing is sort of visualizing what areas in the world are talked about. So you can see in 1800s, Latin America isn't talked about as much. It's mostly Europe and the US. But as we get, as the world starts to light up, you can see India light up. You can see the American Civil War pass by a moment ago. And you can see it's really about the US and Europe. But as we're getting, into the 1900s now, we're seeing more and more of the world lighting up. See Australia light up. You're starting to see, as we get closer and closer, it becomes denser and denser. And this is very interesting. Today, until, of course, we hit the end, and the entire world's interconnected. And this reflects the fact that in Wikipedia, when we talk about the past, oftentimes we're sort of referring about things. In the present, people are really spending a lot of time connecting events. So this happened, so then that caused this to happen, which caused this to happen, or is related to this. So again, this notion of being able to take that big pile. If you think about Wikipedia today, after a decade of life, Wikipedia is still a text box. You go to a box and you type in a keyword to search Wikipedia. But you think about it, it's an encyclopedia. It's rich amounts of locations and dates and all this information that we just can't access today. And so that was the idea behind this, was to be able to visualize that in a new way, to allow interaction with it in fundamentally new ways. This graph up here, so we extracted out every single person name mentioned across anywhere in Wikipedia and who is mentioned alongside of whom. It's a little bit hard to see here, but essentially what you find is that every single person on Earth revolves around a tiny set of core people in the middle. It turns out those are world leaders. Because it turns out around the world, what ends up happening is, pretty much anyone that's important anywhere around the world probably met a world leader or won an award. President Obama shook the person's hand. The Queen knighted the person. And so what you find is that pretty much anyone that gets discussed around Wikipedia probably at some point in their lives, if they're important enough to have their own page on Wikipedia, they probably have come into contact with a world leader somewhere along the line, or a world leader praised their work, for example. Organizations down there in the lower left is much more interesting. So there, what you find is that the world's organizations, there's not like the United Nations. You might think, well, the whole world revolves around a certain core set of organizations. In reality, what we find is that, for example, the energy companies are all tightly interconnected with each other. Human rights organizations are all tightly interconnected with each other. And then whole industries connect with each other. So you don't have sort of a core set of companies that everyone revolves around. And this is interesting. From the standpoint of Wikipedia, what this can tell us, is really fundamental structures in terms of how people are taught, how different types of information information are talked about on the web and what that can tell us. And then a final piece, we made this nice little Google Earth visualization. So it's actually an interactive visualization in Libya. You can set the time slider to what you want, see every point mentioned anywhere in Wikipedia with respect to Libya in that time period, click on a link and go right to that entry in Wikipedia. So a new fundamental way of interacting with very large amounts of information. Now, of course, many of you probably saw the Global Twitter Heartbeat project last year. So this was an idea, what would happen if we took Twitter, plugged it in the back of a big supercomputer, and mapped it second by second as the world was revolving. And so the idea was that only about 3% of tweets are geotagged. And so basically what we did was a massive project to understand how can we, if someone doesn't provide their geographic information in their tweet, how can we sort of induce that? How can we calculate that? And actually, for those of you that do data mining or such, if you use GNIP, they actually use a variant now of this algorithm as the main production algorithm now for geo-enrichment of Twitter. And basically a bunch of interesting stuff here. But the end result is, so you take a tweet and you figure out where the person was when they tweeted, you stick it on a map, and you color coded how positive or negative it is. The problem is you get something like this. It's impossible to see what the heck's going on here. I see there's a lot of tweets in Europe, but I can kind of see some red kind of buried in the green, so it's hard to kind of understand what's happening. So maybe I make each tweet semi-transparent, so that way I can see a little bit more detail. It's still really difficult for me to see, what's going on here. What I'd love to do instead is to make a heat map that actually told me kind of the important areas around. And so I'll save all sort of the math behind it. But basically what we did is we came up with, you've all seen heat maps before, but we came up with a new form of heat map that actually most heat maps measure a single dimension like volume. So if you made a heat map of tweets about Hurricane Sandy, New York and Los Angeles are going to light up and the rest of the country will be dark because there's so many tweets in such a tiny density in those two places, it sort of washes out the rest of the nation. So instead what we did is actually calculate one heat map that's just total number of tweets in every location on Earth at any moment. The other one is what percentage of the tweets in each location are about a topic like Hurricane Sandy. A third one is the overall tone of those, so how positive or negative are those, and then there's some other pieces that look at how close together they are. And then in the end result then is we generate a single heat map that combines all these together. So that way, for example, if you see, for example, yes, there's an enormous number of tweets coming out of New York, but if just a tiny fraction of those are about a topic of interest, it doesn't matter that maybe there were 20,000 tweets out of New York today versus say 10 tweets out of a small town in Illinois. If those 10 tweets on that topic out of Illinois were out of 20 tweets total out of that area, that's pretty significant versus if those 10,000 tweets out of New York were out of 10 million that day. So being able to sort of normalize and bring all that together. So what we get then is, this is actually the first live map actually ever done of a natural disaster through the eyes of Twitter. So this was Hurricane Sandy last year. And you'll notice Hurricane Sandy is going to come up the coast. So bright red is negative, bright blue or green is positive. And it's going to pause here, and you're going to start seeing some tweets. You can see, someone, so positive can be like well wishes. You can see LAX stuff starting to shut down. Someone's upset, they can't study. Someone's really upset. I love that one. Oh, come on, it's not that bad. Some prayer stuff, driving ban. My favorite's the next one. Last Halloween was a snowstorm. This Halloween's a hurricane. Next Halloween's it's going to be the zombie apocalypse. And you'll notice, you might say, well, how could there be any positivity where the hurricane's hitting right now? This is what's called the silver lining effect. So people will literally tweet, they say, I've lost everything, but my family's okay. Nobody was hurt. Even the dog is okay. And so people, even in the worst of everything, they reach for something good in the world. And this is a very interesting phenomenon that we can actually visualize that. The fact that, you think about the hurricane really is only affecting this area, but in reality, it's actually affecting the whole nation. You see, airports shutting down over here. You see people praying for friends and family across. And so just that ability to visualize just how strong, natural disaster. Some of these tweets are amazing. You literally see people tweet, the windows have broken, there's glass everywhere, the roof is starting to crack, it's coming down, I should probably get out of here. But to me, it amazes me that someone's first thought is to tweet about the fact that their house is collapsing around them before they actually decide to leave the house. And I think that tells us something very interesting about society. So this is one that we then did on the US presidential election. And blue is for Obama or against Romney and vice versa. And so what you see here is, and as the election day, now again, we only looked at election day, but one of the things you'll notice is that no single area is red or blue the whole time. It constantly fluctuates. And so what you're really catching is that people are saying, for example, they'll say, I voted for Romney, I voted for Obama, and you're not having this sort of back and forth. Now, prior to election day, you saw a lot of back and forth, but on election day, people have already voted. There's no real, by you saying I voted for Obama, it's not going to change anyone else's vote because they've already voted for the day. And what's interesting is you see that there isn't a strong correlation between discussion on Twitter on election day and voting. And you see obviously areas like Illinois, a lot of Republican stuff. Well, that's because Obama really only won Cook County, Springfield, and Champaign County. He only won 3 counties in Illinois. The rest went for Romney. Same thing actually, in some of these other areas. Now, of course, as you see, it's getting called for Obama. Now more blue, and now with the concession speech, the whole nation runs a lot more blue. So again, the ability to literally visualize it second by second as election day is running, just that ability to really, because you think about phone polling and other things, those only reach a tiny portion of the population, and it's a relatively slow process. So being able to visualize that in real time. And this is a cute little toy. This is what's called a puffer sphere. We actually had this live display. We did this at a conference last year, and this was actually a big 9-foot tall sphere, literally live rotating around, displaying all the tweets around the world live as they were happening. We can do other things. So we can color code each tweet by what language was used to tweet. So you can actually literally see linguistic boundaries across the world. And you can see things like in Russia, you can see population networks. What's really interesting is you can zoom in and actually literally see the border between France and Spain and literally see that language pretty much ends at the border. Literally a house across the border will be speaking a different language. So really that ability to peer into societies in ways that we've just never seen, and see how multilingual areas of the US are. Certain areas of areas of Eastern Europe are highly multilingual. Turns out you can actually zoom into areas like London or Manhattan. You can actually see, for example, where people, where Greeks go when they go to London, what neighborhoods they go to visit, what areas that they like is really interesting. You can actually, because you look for people who normally tweet from a certain area, and then you look at when they're in London, where are they traveling, what languages are they speaking, so you can really start mapping out population flows in ways we've just never been able to do before. You can also do very interesting things. So along the x-axis here, this is how many times 2 people, so basically looked at every pair of people on Twitter that we had locations for, and how often they talk to each other, and then how far apart they are on average. So basically, on average, 2 people that talked once to each other on Twitter in a month are about 800 miles apart. And the more often they talk, the closer they are to each other, which makes sense. Normally you talk to those nearer to you. But turns out if you talk to someone more than 9 times a month, then the more you talk to them, the further away they are. So basically it turns out that basically it tends to be celebrities that people engage with a lot. And and we can do things like this. We can actually visualize sort of the networks of who's talking to whom on Twitter. Because again, Twitter's not something you use to talk to your kids or your spouse or close family members. Twitter's really for something for you to talk to the world. And one of the interesting things we find is that people talk to people near them about half the time. They talk to people on the other end of the globe about half the time. They talk about things next to them in their same city about a quarter of the time. They talk to things within about a 600-mile radius of them about half the time. And the other half of the time, they talk about stuff on the other end of the globe. So Twitter's very interesting because people talk to people near them and about things near them just as often as they talk to people and about things on the other end of the globe. So it's really, again, this interesting way of visualizing things. For the diplomatic folks in the room, you'll like this. So this is not WikiLeaks. This is the declassified Kissinger-era cables. So this is a collaboration with Columbia University. NAR and State are advisors to this. And this project, basically the idea is to take this 3 million cables that were declassified from Kissinger's era, so 1973 to 1976, and basically you get is a big pile of cables, all the cables sent back and forth to missions around the world, sort of like emails. Well, what would that look like? And the problem is if you try to just, you can imagine just take the from field, the to field, and make a nice little network diagram like we did with Wikipedia. The problem is if you try to do that, it just becomes spaghetti because there's just so much traffic back and forth. So this is a neat little visualization. This is what's called the Google Arms Globe. It's something that they built for a different project and gave us the code for it. We've modified it here. So you can actually click on a country like Korea. And this is actually an animation. It's actually, you see these energy pulses. It's really cool looking. But basically you can click on a country like Korea. And then you can see all the cables. Blue are cables sent from other missions around the world, US missions, to the US mission in Korea. Red are outgoing cables. So you can actually then visualize cables coming in, cables going out. There's a little time slider, so you can actually move that back and forth. And then you can see what the original classification levels were of all those cables. So you can see as, wow, all the cables now are moving to secret and top secret. But now they're moving back down to confidential to light secrecy. And you can start seeing, you can actually, and of course moving the time slider, we can see different periods of time. So we can see now in July 76, it's really intense discussion back and forth. You can watch as embassies go dark, like it did in Vietnam. You can watch these really, really interesting patterns here. We can look at Brazil, for example. And so really this way of how do you visualize these vast networks of data that we have today in ways that are interesting. This is another project. So this is basically what American television news tells us about the world. So specifically, this is the Internet Archive's TV News Archive. It's the largest television archive in the world. About 600,000 shows, about 1 petabyte of video. And basically what we did was, the question was, when American television, you think about the American public, television still plays a decent role in a lot of parts of America of what people know about the world around them. So when they watch the evening news, for example, what's the picture of the world that they see? And one of the interesting things is, so this is a dot for every location that was mentioned in American television news over the last 3 years. And you can see that it's actually a fair amount of coverage around the world. Africa, actually, the population centers of Africa, where there's actually population, you actually get a decent amount of coverage there. Now, of course, the issue is that if we look at attention, we can see that Africa doesn't get a ton of attention. The Middle East is getting a ton of attention, obviously, and Asia. Now, what's very interesting then is this graph's really hard to see, but basically each location on Earth is color-coded by how often it's at the beginning of the broadcast, like the evening news opens and they're talking about what. And so versus, sort of buried at the end of the news broadcast where they say, and in other news, here's what else is happening around the world. And it turns out actually that we find that most areas of the world, there is no sort of general area of the world that's always mentioned in the beginning or always mentioned at the end. But we're doing some new work now that shows that certain areas of the world are only talked about with respect to conflict. So when the news talks about them, it's because something bad's happening there or something good's happening there. So again, this notion of being able to look at, for example, if we think about you think about foreign policy and diplomacy, yes, that's made by politicians, those in power, but ultimately they're answerable to the American people. And so you always this question about what do the American people know about what's happening around the world? It always amazes me if you think about Thailand, for example. The average person, here in DC, people know a little bit more about the world. But back where I come from, you ask the average person about Thailand, and they say, "What do you mean there's conflict in Thailand? Do you mean there's been protests there? I went on vacation. I never heard of protests in Thailand." And so this notion of being able to capture, understand what do people know about the world. And of course, we can zoom into the US and see some of these things. So then that leads me to the GDEL project, which is sort of my pride and joy. And the idea behind GDEL is to create a real-time social sciences Earth observatory. You think about today, an earthquake occurs anywhere on Earth. And instantly we know about it. The United States Geologic Survey knows about an earthquake that occurs anywhere on Earth within seconds. They know how big it is, where it's heading, who may be impacted. But we don't know that. For probably 99% of the protests that occur today, we will never know what's happened or where they occur. But a lot of these things get recorded in the global media. So how do we catalog all that? I should add my collaborators on this, Philip Schroed, who was at Penn State University, now at Paris, and Patrick Brand at UT Dallas. And the idea behind GDEL is very simple. Scoop up the entirety of the world's news media every day and process it. Very simple, of course. Not a very large goal at all. So how close are we to this? Today we are working to monitor as much as possible of all available news media we can get worldwide. So that is a large fraction of the stuff published on the web. That's a decent, ever-growing collection of things like low-power broadcasts around the world that's translated for us. Also citizen media around the world. We have actually one of the largest awards from Google Translate for research. We're actually scaling up to machine translate ultimately the entirety of the world's non-English news every day. And so, what do we do with all this? So we attempt every day to sort of scoop up the entirety of the world's media the best we can, basically monitor all that media from every corner of the earth, bring all that back, and then what we want to do with it is a couple of things. One is we want to catalog anything that's happening around the world. If you think about the news media, it's sort of a daily catalog of what's occurring on the planet. It's a biased catalog. It doesn't capture everything, but it's the best that we can do for most areas of the world. So you can imagine a sentence. Iraqi leaders criticize Turkey Monday for bombing Kurdish militants in northern Iraq with airstrikes that they said left at least one woman dead. And so, basically what it does is it goes into that text and actually extracts out, that basically there's an event. The Iraqi government criticized Turkey. And then it also catalogs the fact that Turkey bombed Kurdish rebels in Iraq. And so basically what it's doing is taking this textual blob of text and codifying that into a database entry. Because the thing is that if you hand a machine a pile of text and you say, are riots increasing or decreasing in Thailand right now, there's not much that you can do with that. But you do, when the machine catalogs this becomes, you could literally, graph this in Microsoft Excel and say how many riots per month are there. Now, this is actually, I think Saris actually did this. I think this is Dave Massad actually, or one of the Saris Analytics guys. And so they did a neat little analysis of GDEL in Cairo and plotting out all locations. What was really interesting is that, the news media in some areas of the world, it just says like northern Iraq. In other areas, you actually get, God, these are auto-advancing on me. You actually get individual buildings. So it's really interesting. You can actually sort of watch and trace as violence is going places. This is one New Scientist magazine did. So they traced out the Syrian conflict this is actually interactive features, so you can actually plot out as violence is ebbing and flowing. It turns out it actually matches Syria Tracker very well, actually up until the tactical shift. So we record events. So to us, the chemical weapons attack was one event. Syria Tracker records deaths, not events. And so there's basically a transfer point last year where basically they show deaths start really increasing. We show the number of actually attacks are going downward. That's because he's using fewer, more lethal attacks. We actually now have built-in death, so we can actually track that better. This is another one. This is actually a guy at Cambridge. Actually, what's interesting is he's not he's an area studies person. So this is not a politician or a political scientist, but watching how the media is sort of viewing Russia's sort of look across the world. This is another one. Global John Byler did of global protests around the world. Actually the U.S., there's a new version with the U.S. in here. And so you can actually literally say, give me a map of all the protests around the world at a particular time period. This is one that Josh Stevens and John and a few others did of Afghanistan. So basically mapping out all the protests over the last quarter century in Afghanistan and then actually forecasting what it may look like as of December of this year and June of next year. So it's ability to really start moving towards forecasting. Because you imagine if you can say, here's every riot and protest and a violent attack that's occurred in an area, you can start looking for sort of underlying patterns of where this might head. Also doing a lot of interactive exploration. So actually being able to, we're working a lot with Google right now on how can we actually allow you to explore 250 million records. So right now this is 250 million records for every country, 1979 to present. So it's a huge amount of data. And so for example, one of the questions came in, are there more protests worldwide since the Arab Spring? And the answer is yes. Now, whether that's because there actually are more protests worldwide, or if that's because the media is talking about them a lot more because they missed the Arab Spring, the early stages of it, so they want to jump onto it, that's unknown. But we can say from a global media perspective, the media certainly is reporting a lot more protests. In Thailand, we're seeing a lot more, as expected, connections. So that's one part. One part is just cataloging what's occurring around the world, all these events, riots, protests, coups, over 300 categories of things. The thing that's most exciting to me is, so there's the notion of cataloging what's occurring across the world. And that's very valuable because we don't have a good catalog anywhere of all the events around the world. But the other thing is, as one of my dear friends and mentors once said, in some areas of the world, we have much better ways of knowing which way the tanks are rolling than reading about in the newspaper the next morning. But what we don't have is trying to understand how people are feeling about that, how people are reacting to that, what are the influencer networks surrounding this. So the global knowledge graph, the idea there is to go through every one of those news articles worldwide each day, extract out every person name, every company name, every organization name, every location, over 175 themes. So it's everything from food and water access to functional actors like children or burglars, to discussions of cyber warfare, emotions, events, and then counts of things like number of people killed or wounded or protesting, and then things like natural disasters or things like political parties. So you can imagine basically going through each article, pulling out all this information, and then building a gigantic basically network file where every one of these is a node in that network, and then all the interconnections are who's being mentioned alongside of whom around the world. And so this allows us to go beyond what's physically happening around the world to what's the context around it. So this is Mubarak. So this is actually graphing if you take all the news media around the world, what they're saying about Mubarak each day, how positive or negative is that? And it turns out actually that it's a little bit hard to see the dates here, but it really starts dropping off a cliff and actually it bottoms out just before he leaves office. And you actually see this for a lot of other political leaders. It turns out actually the big troughs here, when it's really deep diving, that actually usually is reflective of periods in his tenure tenure where he was under increased, let's say, at least stress. There was increased risk to him politically. And so we can do a lot of interesting things like this. We can also do, I also visualize the networks of this. So here, actually, this is a neat little sequence. This is all the world's ethnic groups. So all the ethnic groups list or recognized by the CIA World Factbook. And basically, what ethnic groups co-occur with what ethnic groups. So you can actually see, this is 5-year increments, we can actually watch, so we can watch sort of the different ethnic groups of the world being connected, and we can see they're starting to form into this complex where you have sort of East and West. We have this much tighter interconnection. So you can actually sort of visualize, according to the global news media, what ethnic groups are discussed alongside of what ethnic groups around the world. This is a piece that we did with actually U.S. Army CERL. And the goal of this project was to say, can we map out discussion of themes around the world geographically? So this was actually a prototype that was done. This is 1 day of English language global coverage of the Mexican drug cartels. And we basically made a heat map of every location on Earth discussed alongside the Mexican drug cartels that day. Turns out this actually matches DEA's map quite closely at that time period. Now the beautiful part is, of course, you wouldn't use this for drug things, because we have better ways of knowing where they are in the US. But what you can use this for is take, for example, a new terror group that's emerging. You don't know a lot about them right now. But you can map out their spatial footprint and see where are they being discussed, what is sort of their footprint throughout the world. Or take a theme like food security, for example, or cybersecurity. Make a global map of cybersecurity each day. Tell me areas that are shifting alongside, areas that it's increasing discussion, decreasing discussion. You can actually go through and compile a list of all of the companies that are mentioned alongside cyber each day. And then the helicopters are coming, I love that. Just as I talk about cybersecurity. I'm sure it's a black helicopter too. And so then you can actually then sort of compile lists of what are all the emerging startups, what are new companies that are mentioned alongside of cyber each day. And then this one down here is another project we're doing, very similar, but we're applying it to about 5 billion pages. Almost everything has been digitized in the 19th century America, and we're actually plotting out the American Civil War and how it plays. We're looking actually there at the spread of ideas. So take something like states' rights. We can literally watch, because not where books are published, because books are only published in a few areas at that time period, but any location mentioned, when any book published in 1861 talks about states' rights, what are the locations that are mentioned alongside of it? How you can actually watch these ideas move through time and space, collide, inflect, and then bring little bits of each other with them. So really, really powerful, being able to do things at these scales. This is a real fun one. So this is, so this is going to be, I'm actually, my foreign policy column will be starting here, hopefully another week or so. This is one of my early posts, actually, was Obamacare. So what you're seeing here, very similar to the Twitter stuff, but this is based on American domestic news outlets across the country. And this is not where the news is being published, but anything published in the US, any location mentioned in that with respect to Obamacare, how positive, what areas are lighting up and how positive or negative is that. What's really interesting is you can kind of see, this is going back to April, this is actually a couple, I think the first, forgot what months this is, but basically you actually watch the nation start darkening towards Obama. Actually, I think this is the last 4 months, sorry. So this is October, September, and on back. So you can actually watch the nation kind of darkening about, it's actually in September, it actually lightened up a little bit. And then obviously the nation's really darkening, but we can really start kind of visualizing. It's almost like a storm cloud sort of rolling in. And we can start kind of understanding what people are saying more, how issues are being portrayed or perceived by the media, and what that might tell us about, say, how people might feel about these things. This is a fun little graph. So this is actually the world of Snowden and WikiLeaks and Julian Assange. And so what this graph is right here. This is Snowden to his somewhere. Okay, so this is Snowden. This is Obama. Somewhere in here, let's see. Putin is right up here, and I forgot. Oh yeah, and then this is Assange down here. So this was Manning and his group. Some of let's see. Basically what you're seeing here is each person that would, but basically what I did here was take all the news coverage worldwide about Snowden, Manning, Assange, WikiLeaks since April of this past year, extracted out every person that occurred in any of that news coverage, each one's a little dot on here, and then any names that occur with each other in articles get lines connected between them, and the color coding are what ones are basically most interconnected with each other. And so basically what you're able to see is how interconnected, what are the core actors in the global discussion about, say, Snowden and Manning and WikiLeaks and all this good stuff. Who are sort of the newsmakers in that? How are people interacting with each other in the news media? But more importantly, too, we can kind of see that all the Snowden revelations are really sort of being kept separate from WikiLeaks. WikiLeaks really is not part of that discussion. There's usually reference that, oh, by the way, there were some earlier disclosures, but Snowden and that is really staying separate. You're really seeing kind of this interconnection, just how tightly he's interconnected with Obama and Putin. But then you can kind of see all these other little clusters here, little communities, little sort of different bits and pieces of that story. And you can actually watch as they're sort of ebbing and flowing and evolving as the story moves onward. From a negotiation standpoint, you could do something like this. So this is actually the Iranian network. And so this is the same thing, but all people mentioned alongside of Iran in the global media since April of this past year. And what's very interesting is that the Iranian leaders themselves are this little yellow kind of thing over in the corner. Basically what we find is that across the world, when people talk about Iran, it's not about sort of Iran's perspective on the world. It's, well, here's what the US wants, so here's what Iran needs to be able to do for us. And this is very interesting because domestically they perceive that very strongly. In fact, that's actually, one thing that you see a lot in the domestic Iranian press is just how the world sort of says, here's what Iran's going to do, here's what we want, so here's what you're going to do for us. But it's also very interesting because it really reflects the fact that, if you repeat this for other things like Syria and some of these others, they're much more centralized. So this is really showing that it's much less about sort of Iran's role in this and more of, sort of here's all the actors around it and, here's what needs to happen there. We can do other things. So for example, we can take an industry like say the Nigerian oil industry and then take all those people and interconnections between them and actually look, oftentimes what you see on the fringes are people like analysts, for example. So like that Bloomberg analyst who's always the one sort of doing the latest advisories on it, or the New York Times reporter who's always the one who's covering it most closely. Those can be very valuable from say a diplomacy standpoint. Those are people that have their own sort of networks of intelligence into that country. So let's say that you're someone in the U.S. government, a diplomat that's trying to say engage with things. Those can be other sources of information. Let's say that all of a sudden there's a problem. There's a huge scandal erupting. Let's say there's a corruption scandal somewhere. Well, your normal entry points into that government, they may be disrupted because of the damage control. And so those can be alternative entry points because they probably know other people, lower people that have greater information about what's going on. So sort of a find an expert system. Also, you can start seeing, for example, academics, business leaders, universities are tightly interconnected. These can be very valuable because you could actually start seeing, for example, what university does, say, the agriculture minister tend to really interact with a lot according to the media. You can see in Iran, actually, what's very interesting is that the supreme leader is almost absent from the global media discussion. He gets mentioned, but actually fairly rarely, and always in a passing context of, oh, by the way, there's the supreme leader. Now, of course, in reality, so that is something you always have to keep in mind, is that this is the media's perspective of the operational infrastructure of how organizations or countries operate. So, for example, obviously, the supreme leader is the one who actually calls the shots there. But if you look at from a media perspective, he really isn't mentioned. Now, that obviously is reflecting the fact that he, for a variety of reasons, keeps a low profile. He doesn't, he isn't quoted every time the president of Iran says something. He's not out there, alongside of him making a similar speech. But you can capture that, so you can really start understanding, these different elements of things. And then, of course, what you can do, which is really fun, a much cooler version of this will be appearing in Foreign Policy magazine in December. But what you can do then is take all the people across every topic, so not by country or by topic, but take every single person mentioned in the global news media over the last half year. Take every one of those people and put all of those into a single network over the entirety of the global conversation. And what becomes very exciting about this is you can actually start seeing different communities. Some of these are country clusters. Some of these are topical clusters. And so you start seeing, for example, say domestic American politicians. Who are they most closely to? So, for example, Harry Reid, Nancy Pelosi, the different Republicans. Who are they more closely connected to? Are they more closely connected, say, to Israeli politicians or to Canadian politicians? How much interaction? Which politicians are more closely sort of aligned or discussed in the news media alongside Putin versus the premier of China? So this becomes very, very interesting because we can really start visualizing the entirety of what the global news is telling us about human society. And of course, it just looks cool. But there's actually real value because you can actually drill down into these things for the first time and really start teasing out So for example, with Canada, you see, it's very interesting, you see things, for example, with Egypt, you see all the internal leadership of Egypt, you actually see successive layers. So you see, for example, the layers like the Muslim Brotherhood, obviously the core army, the core army personnel that most closely interact with the US. You see all of them at the buffer layer that most closely interacts with the US. And so you'll see they're more closely connected with Kerry than they are to Obama. But then you start seeing successive layers inwards. You see, for example, those that interact more with these, once in a while they interact with the US, but they're more sort of successive layers. And then you have all the way down here, people that are discussed a lot alongside of, say, the Egyptian army, but never in context with the US, always in context of these successive layers. So you can actually tease out. Now again, that may or may not be how the Egyptian army really functions. In this case, largely it does match the reality. Again, you're getting the media's perspective on that, but that can be very, very valuable. That can also be very valuable. Let's say that you're doing nation building somewhere around the world. You know the reality of what you're doing there. What you want to be able to understand is how are the people feeling about this. So obviously there's the well-known case, was it Afghanistan or Iraq, where the U.S. military was doing vaccination of livestock as one of these nation building efforts, and the insurgent groups, one of the local insurgent groups, spread a rumor that in fact they were poisoning them, and that in a month's time all the livestock that had been vaccinated was going to die. So of course this caused a massive backlash, and it actually took a while for people to sort of figure out what exactly was happening here. Had you been able to observe that in real time, you can start doing course correction. You think about companies today. No company will do a large sort of big press campaign, or no company should do a very large press campaign and then worry about how people are perceiving it. Most companies today, they're doing these incredible campaigns now where as they're messaging, they're watching how people are reacting to it. They're constantly shifting their messaging around that. Now obviously politicians have done that since the dawn of time, but you think about from a diplomatic standpoint, oftentimes our messaging. So for example, you look at the messaging, the war of messages back and forth with Iran. Obviously every word is chosen. When Kerry gives a speech, it's very, very well chosen wording, obviously. But you look at that, a lot of that wording it's sort of, I would call it almost like 1990s time style. It's sort of, on a day-to-day basis, you'll sort of watch the wording shift a little bit. You're not seeing it second by second. That you see in the corporate world, you literally will see, campaigns ebbing and flowing. You'll see advertising pull, new ones moving constantly. We're not yet at that stage with diplomacy. And I think that's one of the most interesting aspects of where we're at today, is that, essentially, from my perspective, I mean, as our physical and digital heartbeats, continue to beat, our collective heartbeat, it's giving us the ability to understand human society in ways we've never been able to before. Diplomacy is always going to be based on that handshake, but really where big data, where this big data blueprint of society can help us, is it can really help guide us on whose hand to shake and in what order. So thank you very much, and this is my book if you're interested. So thank you very much.
We have time for a few questions, so please.
Question in the back, yes.
Thank you very much for your talk. Really interesting. I'm very new to this form of analysis, so pardon any ignorance. But I was curious about your sentiment dictionaries and how you are trying to understand what words are present, specifically since you're doing a global kind of analysis. So I have a question, how closely do you code stuff? And then my second question is just about what you just said, applying those real-time, approaches to our diplomacy, which is very interesting and might make for better diplomacy. But since there's already recently this sort of global backlash against what the United States does with the NSA and how we use people's data against them, how do you think once people find out that we're looking and analyzing their tweets as a formal part of diplomatic efforts, that would influence their on-the-ground perspective?
Yeah, no, these are great points. So from the sentiment standpoint, and one quote I should have put in here, I always love to paraphrase the great Indiana Jones by saying that big data is about patterns, not truth. If it's truth you're after, the philosophy department's down the hallway. Big data is really about leveraging machines to find interesting patterns there. So when it comes to sentiment, and sentiment is actually is a really big issue because obviously it's the hot thing today. Everyone's rushing into this space. There's been a couple of big publications calculations have come out this year and last year on what are the happiest and saddest cities on Twitter, for example. Most of those use a tonal dictionary called the ANEW, which is a tonal dictionary out of U of Florida. Now this dictionary has its roots in another dictionary that comes from 1985. And this is basically it's been modified a little bit, but largely has provenance in the mid 80s. The problem with this is that the word cool, for example, is not in there. Words like obsequious are, which doesn't get used on Twitter as much. Emoticons, smiley faces, entirely absent. And so, these were dictionaries, they weren't designed for that. These dictionaries, when they were built in the 1980s, were state-of-the-art. They were built for like news material and formal publications. So they use very formal language. But the problem is that people say, ooh, tonal dictionary, Twitter, plug them together and we're off to the races. So we've got some data here. So that is something I always suggest, anytime you're leveraging these type of analytic tools, always look at the stuff you're getting back. Another famous example is a lot of people use tonal dictionaries to study political parties, like political discourse, like for example, what two politicians are saying. Most tonal dictionaries have the word party in there. It's a very positive thing. And so when you talk about the Republican Party or the Democratic Party, and you can even add issues. So for example, one major publication, one of the major US newspapers, went through a period in the 70s and 80s where it kept alternating whether it would say Democrats, Republicans for a couple of years, and then it would say Democratic Party, Republican Party for a while. So you actually see that, politics have become negative, positive, negative, positive, negative, positive. So one of the things that we do for sentiment, so one of my studies actually looked at about all 1,800 of the open source tonal dictionaries out there. Tone's a very interesting one. So we have a whole bunch of projects around tone right now. Specifically, for example, a lot of tonal words depend on who you are. So, if you go back, for example, Civil War, the word Yankee could be a very positive term if you were in the South, a very negative term, or if you were in the North, a very negative term if you were in the South. Today there are a lot of words that, depending on if you're from, for example, a certain group and you use that word, it can be a very positive word. If you use it in a different context, a very negative word. Certain words like, for example, redneck. Larry the Cable Guy, because of Larry the Cable Guy, people go around with bumper stickers now saying, proud redneck. And this used to be a very negative term. Coming from the deep South, I've seen, kind of that ebb and flow of these. And so, tone is a very complicated one. You have a lot of master narratives, for example. So knowing, for example, that a cartoon that features, say, God probably won't generate too much. A cartoon that features, say, the Prophet Muhammad can generate enormous amounts. So you have a lot of these narratives. So this is something that we're doing a lot of, and specifically ground truthing. So we have several very large projects where we're taking large amounts of media and then ground truthing those against actually ground collected data. So we're doing a lot of that type of stuff. And then, what was your second question? Was that part of it?
Like data and diplomacy.
Yes. So, this is the thing. The way I always phrase it is, companies do a lot more. I mean, governments do very little compared to what companies do in terms of. Every little advertisement you see on the web today, you'd be amazed at how much data of your life presence in the web feeds into the particular advertisement that you see. If you ever notice, you go to Amazon and you shop for something unique, like a certain Christmas present for someone, like a certain type of necklace from say an obscure vendor. Every website you go to, from CNN to the comedy channel out there, all of a sudden you're gonna see advertisements for that. And what's really interesting is you even notice that the price constantly comes down oftentimes if you're lucky, because these networks know they're watching you and they're watching the fact that, hey, maybe you hovered a little bit more this time. Maybe if we drop it down just a little bit more, you might go for it. And so, I think people are becoming more acclimatized to the fact that this type of stuff happens. But obviously, the Snowden, affair has changed a little bit. But I think there's a big distinction between the public sphere and the private sphere. I think what really has caused the Snowden affair to cause ripple waves is the fact that they were compromising what we assume to be private information. So, like when you post a picture or post on Facebook and you do a private message, there's sort of an assumption that that's private. But if you post something on, say, a blog for the world to see, or you tweet and set it to public, there's sort of an assumption that this is going to get processed by the world. And so I think there's to a degree, I think and the other thing too is, like, take for Iran for example, the Canadian Foreign Ministry has enormous e-diplomacy initiative that's actually in collaboration with many of those dissident groups to help promote and see. It's all grassroots driven, but technologically sort of providing those tools for people to get their voices out. And Google as well does a number of these initiatives around the world. A lot of the tech companies, Facebook, Twitter, each of them has initiatives to help people within countries, especially repressive regimes, get their voices out to the world and heard by the rest of the world. Probably the most telling thing to me with that question is on Twitter across the world today, people tweet in their own languages. Their user biography field is set in their own language, but the user location field, which is where you hand type in your location, that's in English across the world. Outside of a few countries in Asia, like if you are say tweeting in Arabic or Russian, for example, your tweets are in that language. Like say you're tweeting in Russian. Your tweets are in Russian, your user biography is in Russian, but your location field is English. And these are hand typed. These are not provided by software. And one of the things that we found going through and reaching out to a lot of these groups was that by and large across the world, there's sort of a recognition today that the location field is being processed by machines. So people, is being searched and so on. And there's sort of this recognition that, let's say I'm in Russia and I'm tweeting. I don't necessarily care that someone who only speaks English can understand what I'm saying, but I do want them to know I exist. I do want them to include my voice in that sort of that catalog of things. And so I think the fact that we're seeing more and more that people are trying to get their voices out there, I think that as long as you stay in the public sphere, I think will be less of an issue. Any more questions? Quiet group here. Wow. Hey, question in the back.
Kind of on that same topic, it seems like some of the public stuff is having an impact on the private stuff. For instance, like with Brazil wanting to mandate localization of data and whatnot. And if that did somehow have, so I guess it's kind of a tack on the last question. I mean, could that eventually, if you had a company like Google or something decide to pull out of Brazil, what kind of impact would that have on this trend towards more and more data and more globalized data?
So we've already seen actually a fair amount of that. So in Egypt, most companies, as Egypt sort of headed down, actually a while back, most companies pulled out of Egypt because the Egyptian government, so certain governments, so for example, Google has not had a formal presence in Egypt for a while, largely because when you have a formal presence, that's a pressure point for local government. And this has happened, I think, which was it? Was it China? One of them actually arrested, was this last year? I forget which country it was, but they arrested the senior Google staff in that country and said, we're holding them under detention until you cough up. Here's a list of dissident people. We want all their emails, and we're going to hold these people in prison until you cough it up. And so increasingly, companies are sort of pulling ground staff out of nations. So we already see some of that, or in other nations because of regulatory rules, like Europe now is mandating more and more that data about its citizens stay within the borders of those nations. But yet that doesn't seem to have had that broad of an impact because, the thing today is that, while certain companies are sort of, like Facebook, for example, is dominant in social in many areas of the world, obviously not in all areas. You have everything from vContact to Weibo to some of the new emerging things like Klub or Baotarin in Iran. More and more, though, information really is becoming borderless today. People are they're using whatever platform's available to them. So as platforms disappear, as platforms go dark, or as they're blocked, new platforms spring into their way. And so I think, I think that people, what amazes me is that, as more details have come out, like, for example, after some of the first rounds of stuff start coming out about, say, how much we're surveilled online by advertising companies, that didn't really bring around a shift. All these, people talked about, we're going to leave Facebook, we're going to leave Twitter, we're going to sign off of our social media accounts. That never materialized. When Facebook changed its privacy, the biggest thing to me is when Facebook changed its privacy settings and said, now we reserve all these new rights to do all these different things. And there was this, you probably remember all this news coverage, everybody was talking about, I'm leaving Facebook for good. You didn't even see even the tiniest bit. In fact, it didn't even level off. Basically, you see no change whatsoever in the growth rate. And so I think, people talk about a lot of this stuff, but it's like NSA, for example. Okay, so they're monitoring. You can imagine they're monitoring most cell phone conversations around the world. How many of us went away and burned our cell phones that afternoon when all that came out and said, we're never going to use a cell phone ever again because I don't want to be monitored. I'm only going to meet with people face to face in a cornfield, where there's no bugs around it. These are sort of pieces of life. Whether or not we think that they're good things or bad things, I think people. It's really interesting because to me, I just look at. 50 years ago or 100 years ago, governments had to pay a lot of money to try and surveil their citizens. Today, really, people do a really good. People are willing to pay to help be surveilled. You think about people, Facebook, for example. How many, probably many people in this room have a Facebook account. Probably, well, maybe not all of you, but a lot of you probably pour a lot, especially the younger ones that are still in college, probably are pouring a lot of your imagery out. Like, going out, evening out, or, evening out with the family, or you go, trick-or-treating. I know, like everyone I know, like after trick-or-treating, all of a sudden, like all the people that I know that have kids, all that imagery is flooding into the newsfeed. And it's actually quite interesting because, I have friends in enough parts of the country, I use it basically as a weather forecast. What was the weather like? So you can see, oh, it was raining there, it was snowy over here, it was a little bit colder over here. Wow, over here they're wearing short sleeves, that's amazing. And so, you think about people really, I think we all, and like reality TV is a very interesting realm now. I think that really, a good portion of the population, people, they want to be famous. They want to be known. Maybe not, Kim Kardashian famous, but, they want to be out there. And what's very interesting is, why does social media work? I mean, all Facebook did, they didn't come up with this fundamental new way of interacting. Just basically made a website where you can upload stuff about yourself. And why did that work? Why has that grown to 1 billion people on Earth today? Well, because it gives us a way to tell the world about ourselves, to be famous. And even as Facebook fades, potentially a little bit now, some of the latest numbers saying that. And the other thing too is you look at like the younger generation, the teens now are moving away from Facebook potentially. Some of the latest numbers, they're moving to new forms of communication. And so I think that over time, I think people intrinsically they want to tell the world about themselves. They want certain parts of their lives to be private. Like most people, they want their medical records private. They want certain parts of their lives sealed off, but they want other parts of their lives to be out there. And I think the issue with Snowden is that the government trepped into those areas that people like to have private versus the places that they're happy of having public. So I think that's sort of the big thing. I think I'm getting shepherd cooked off here.
Well, I'm afraid that we're out of time. Thank you so much to the audience for joining us today. This is an amazing topic. Caleb will be teaching a class in the spring about it. We'll be running a conference about this topic as well. And thank you so much for this great talk. I appreciate it.